Hello, Ancient Warfare folks, and welcome to the almost last unit of this class, wherein we discuss the transition of the Roman legion from its manipular form, these small modular units, to the cohort legion. I'm going to be glossing over a lot of chronology here, so just kind of sit tight and go with me. We're going to be talking about developments that began following the final defeat of Carthage in 146 BCE and were solidified mostly by the 1st century BCE and took off under the emperors. So we begin at 146 BCE, where Rome is flush with success. Not only have they won the Third Punic War, but they've also conquered Corinth and the Greek-speaking world. At this point, as you can see on the map, by 146 BCE, Rome had everything that's included in purple, that kind of like purpley periwinkle color, and green. By 44 BCE, that had extended into the yellow areas. That's Julius Caesar's fault. Alas, we won't be spending a ton of time with him. But the point is, Rome gobbled up huge amounts of territory in a very short time period. And with that territory came a huge influx of human beings taken as prisoners of war and trafficked as chattel, which meant that in Italy itself, people with a lot of money owned a lot of other human beings. And those freeborn people of Italy who had been small family farmers were being kicked off of their lands in record numbers so that wealthy Romans could farm that land with enslaved workers in kind of a large agribusiness sort of situation. What this meant is that although Rome's 1% had never been doing better, spoils of war, lots and lots of money, tons of power, the folks who hadn't made out very well in this situation, the poor, the less flush merchant class, and even some of the upper class too, were out of land, out of options, and increasingly unable to move upward in the economic structure. There were huge numbers of homeless poor people in the cities of Italy, especially in the city of Rome proper. And this meant that Rome was in social crisis. Not just Rome itself, but the Italian allies. You'll recall that the cities of Italy for a while now had been a target of foreign invaders as different people sought to turn Italians against the city-state of Rome, with very little progress being made there. But the city-states, or rather the Italian allied states of Rome, were becoming increasingly twitchy at their lack of rights compared to citizens of the city of Rome proper. This eventually leads to a war between Rome and its allies. It's a very weird war, the social wars. One of the few instances where people have gone to war with somebody in order to join. The Italian allies, by the way, lost the social wars but got citizen rights, so actually they kind of won. All of this is to say that Rome does not benefit across the board from its imperialist activity in the 2nd century, the 100s BCE. And in fact, following 146 BCE, their success leads to a series of crises that eventually ends up bringing down the Roman constitution as they knew it, transitioning Rome from a government ruled by semi-democratic processes into a government ruled by an autocratic emperor, starting with Augustus. So how do we get there? And what does this have to do with military reforms and restructuring? Sit tight. That's what we're doing. Our story doesn't necessarily begin, but a good reference point is with the migration of the Cimbri and the Teutones. This was a group from the Jutland Peninsula who, due to climate change and some poor harvests, decided to pick up stakes and to send colonizing parties south, as lots of other people had done in Northern Europe for generations before and generations after too. So the Cimbri and the Teutones take a wandering sort of course southward, ending at the Alps, where they try to move into Roman territory. First Roman territory and what's now the south of France, and eventually they cross the Alps, just like Hannibal did, and begin to attack Rome itself. And Rome panicked. It seemed like we were going to have another Brennus incident on our hands, where people were coming in from Northern Europe, raiding into Italy, but this time not just raiding, they were bringing women and children with them and in an attempt to settle, to take Roman territory, to hold it for themselves, and to set up shop. And Rome's early attempts to repel the Cimbri and the Teutones from Italy failed miserably. Consuls were killed, armies were lost, things were looking pretty bad. So at this point, Rome brings in an experienced career general by the name of Gaius Marius. We'll meet him on the next slide. And they give him broad powers to recruit for his legions and to restructure the legions in order to become less pathetic against this particular crisis. So on to the specific changes and the man himself. Here he is, Gaius Marius. He was consul, that's what the COS period means. So he was consul beginning in the year 107 and going straight on into the year 100, so 7 years of consulship. For those of you who are familiar with Roman consulship, this should raise your eyebrow a bit. So Roman consuls, that is co-presidents, were only supposed to be in office for 1 year. This is 7 years? That's unprecedented at this point, although once you set a precedent, it tends to be repeated, and this is one of several things that Gaius Marius sets into action. So the crisis was felt to be so overwhelming and the need for a single leader in a crisis so pressing that Gaius Marius was given the consulship for first 5 years, and then it was extended a little bit at the end, in order to get rid of the Cimbri and the Teutones and to secure Italy's northern border along the Alps. He was consul again in the year 87. It didn't work out quite so well for him. It's a story for another day, though. So, with his unprecedentedly long consulship, Marius was also given free rein to recruit in ways that had not been allowed before, at least on the books. It seems that it had been an unofficial custom on the books for about a generation before Marius to not check for property qualifications when recruiting people into the legion. You may recall that in the Manipular Legion, your citizen status and the amount of property you owned was related to where you stood in the triplex acies, right? If you were not as wealthy and powerful, you stood near the front. If you were more wealthy and powerful, you were back near the triarii. Marius officially now threw this out the window, and at first he did it by taking recruits and then basically saying, you totally have property, and they'd be like, oh yeah, I totally have property. Quickly, though, he got authorization to recruit from the homeless poor in Rome, which is why it was important to talk about changes in the Roman economy after 146 BCE. All of these homeless Romans, before this point, weren't qualified to join the Roman army because there was a property qualification to join. With Marius's official right to recruit from this disinherited population, Marius suddenly had this huge population that he could recruit legionaries from. And he sweetened the deal by promising to people who fought with him as his veterans land at the end of their service. So this wasn't just a thing for homeless people to go and do, is join the Roman legion, but it was also offered as a path back into the economically upwardly mobile ladder. That is, if you served with the Roman legion at the end of your contracted term of service, you would be granted some land for you and your family to inherit. Ideally, this would be Italian countryside, and this was the gold standard that generals after Marius kept trying to offer. But realistically, what ended up happening and was part of the standard veterans retirement package for the next couple of centuries is that whatever land you had been serving abroad in, you would get a little bit of farmland in that area. And this was a way that Rome incentivized the conquest of new territory and, not coincidentally, fed Roman appetites for conquering more land. If you are now horrified, like, didn't we end up with a lot of homeless people because we just conquered way too much land without a sustainability plan? Well, that's a bit of a problem still. Sustainability tends not to be one of the primary considerations of conquest. What is a primary consideration under this model is paying your troops. And if you're paying your troops in land, and Italian countryside is really expensive and owned by Roman one percenters, then conquering new land and then gifting it to your veterans is a really great way to motivate your troops and pay them when you're done in an economically viable way at the low cost of hundreds of thousands, well, no, I think it's going into the millions now, of people who are being conquered, killed, dispossessed, and trafficked so as to make room for Roman veterans. Lovely. So at any rate, Marius gets the right to recruit without property qualifications. And by doing so, he makes himself patron to his troops. So a quick note about what patron means in the Roman system. For a long time now, so Marius didn't invent this, it was customary for wealthy Romans to take responsibility for less wealthy Romans in return for their support and services at discounted rates. One of the ways that you got to be a patron was by owning people that you subsequently freed, and then these freedmen would then be required to offer you goods and services for free and to vote for you when you were up for office and help you with your campaigns and so on. So this relationship of patron and then the lower status person was called a client, was baked into the Roman social structure. If this sounds like the mafia, that's not a coincidence. The mafia is built on Roman social structures. So this idea that you have a boss and he's got sub-bosses and then everyone gets kickbacks down through the line. Romans, if not invented that, at least popularized that. If this sounds a lot like what we think Proto-Indo-Europeans were doing, they might be responsible for this, but it's not an uncommon way for societies to structure themselves. This is just the Italian flavor. With this move, where the general is responsible for paying their homeless veterans with a home, suddenly generals became much more influential. Your general wasn't just the consul for that year who comes in, takes over your army, and then leaves the next year when you elect somebody else. This has been happening for a long time too. Scipio, for instance, had his army for many years, and that's why they were so loyal and so effective. This is a good way to run your army. You don't want a lot of turnover in your upper command. You want continuity. So by solidifying this with Marius, where he was both consul and had the right to recruit and was responsible for paying his recruits, his success allowed him to make himself politically powerful in a ludicrous way because part of how you get elected consul for 7 years running is that you win a lot of military successes, lots and lots of veterans owe you, and they come out to vote for you in the polls. Now, once Marius does this successfully, and well, Scipio did it before him, so this had been done for a while, you suddenly make generals very politically powerful, and powerful in a way that bypasses Roman elections to an extent, because your general continues to be your general whether he's consul or not under this system. You remember the guy who recruited you, and you're relying on him and his military success to pay you. That's going to be important because the next constitutional development in Roman history is the introduction of the Roman emperor, and this is how you do that. But at any rate, the general now becomes a political figure with a lot of clout, and somebody who doesn't necessarily need to have name recognition. Gaius Marius didn't have a lot of famous ancestors, which was unusual in Rome of this time. Most people who ran for office and got elected got there because their ancestors were famous and they were part of a dynasty. Marius, however, was a competent general, and this confluence of competence in the field and political savvy works really well for him, and that isn't lost on a generation of Roman politicians afterwards. Another thing that begins to happen under Marius, although it had been happening again earlier, is that for Italian allies who sign up to fight with the Roman legions, first, certain Italian city-states are given the right to send their men into the regular Roman legions. Other city-states send what they called socii, or allied units. So the Roman army wasn't just the Roman citizen army, but also armies fielded from their loyal allies who would fight for Rome under Roman command. At this time, that became another path of citizenship. So something generals would do to reward allies who served the Roman army, and this was something that happened for King Massinissa and the Numidians to a certain extent earlier, was that you would get citizen rights, including the right to vote. And guess what? If you're a general and you need more people to vote for you, a really great way to have that happen is to reward your faithful allied military forces with voting rights. Yeah, so this is a bit of a 1-2 punch that allowed generals to gather huge amounts of power. The final thing I've already talked about here. So land grants and retirement packages start to become a thing here. This is a time when military service is not just a part of doing business as a Roman citizen. So in the Manipular Legion, the default assumption was that, much like a hoplite, you had your family armor, you served as part of your citizen duty to the state, not because you wanted paid, not because you wanted compensation, not because you needed citizenship or voting rights, but as an expression of your patriotism. After this period, the Roman army more and more was becoming a career path, a way to get citizenship in the first place, a way to support your family, not of course your immediate family. Under this model, soldiers weren't allowed to be married. This didn't stop them, but their marriages weren't officially recognized. You were, at least on paper, supposed to be single, and you would be either keeping your pay for yourself against your retirement, where then you would get married and have little citizen babies, or you would send some of your money home to support your homeless family who'd been kicked off of their farm by other wealthy Romans. What a time to be alive. But that's not the only change to the structure of the Roman army at this point. First, structural reform. we are moving away from maniples. So the maniple for a long time had been increasingly cumbersome, difficult to train with, and it wasn't the tactical advantage it had been in earlier days for a lot of reasons, uh, some of which were scalability. Once you had many maniples on a battlefield, it became increasingly difficult to control them. They didn't do a very good job of managing large massed forces coming against them. You kind of needed something bigger. So that's one thing. Another problem with the maniples is experience stratification. When you have your newbies in the front and your veterans in the back, what you end up with is a lot of people at the front getting killed and then a lot of experience wasted in the back with a lot of frustrated veterans having to watch young idiots die in front of them, which is not really a great working environment, especially if you're homeless and joining the army out of desperation. So we introduced the cohort system. This had been in development for a long time. So Marius, again, doesn't invent this, but he does take it and run with it. So Marius is our convenient start point for this. So 107 BCE is the begin date for the cohorts. Now, a cohort is a unit that combines veterans and raw recruits and spreads them out in staggered formations. They're all mixed together. So an inexperienced soldier is going to be next to more experienced men who will then train them and allow them to progress. But there is some stratification here that allows there to be goalposts to strive for. So our Legos are lined up in an approximation of how this works on the field, although this isn't perfect. So imagine here where I'm scribbling in blue, that's where the enemy would be. The first cohort is the one you want to be in. So the first cohort has the most experienced soldiers because this is the cohort that's going to be going up against the weak side of the enemy, but it's also the side that's most visible on the battlefield and is closest to where the generals and leadership are going to be standing. This is also where you have your most experienced, not officer people. So we begin to see an increased importance of and reliance on what we would now call like non-commissioned officers. So people at the sergeant level, more about them on another slide. So your most experienced badass folks and also a larger number of people are in the first cohort, and that's the prestige unit. So you have slightly less experienced people ranging along the first line, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then the 6th cohort to the 10th cohort. There's a little bit more experience stratification, but even the 10th cohort, you have a good mix of veterans and less experienced people. Now, these units don't just fight together, they live together, they march together. These people become your family, and you have older people and younger people, so you get all of the age differentiation of the family. And these are also little mini villages. We'll talk about some of the benefits of that structure moving up ahead. Now, these units, unlike maniples, don't slide around each other. They're not staggered in quincunx across the battlefield. They don't move between each other as much. They kind of stay put on the field. But what they do is circulate within the units themselves. So that first line of the first cohort is only going to be fighting for about 10 minutes or so. And then the responsibility of the centurion for that cohort is going to be to signal the point at which the people in the front line slip between the gaps in the ranks backwards, and then the second line moves to the front. And I'll put a scene from HBO's Rome from the Battle of Alesia so you can see this in action. It's quite clever. So this means that Rome is still circulating fresh troops to the front. They're making the most out of their scutum shields, but they're not overcomplicating this. So they're making it easier to train people and to get them up to fighting form. This creates a much more robust front for the enemy to face, and much less opportunities for the enemy to use the complexity of the maniples against the Romans. We're not going to be like Hannibal and create log jams with as much ease as we did at Cannae. But some things remain the same. The cavalry is still on either side of the unit. This is the gold standard for battlefield formations, gosh, right on into the 1800s, because it's classic. The cavalry moves quickly and controls the back of the enemy's infantry formation, and you use it to keep control of a battlefield and use your mobility to best effect. There's not a lot of places to put your cavalry, really, and that's where they are. Interestingly, Rome did have some Roman cavalry. People who were wealthy enough to afford their own horse were a specific kind of middle class-ish. The Romans called this the equestrian order. So these weren't the most wealthy people in Rome. These didn't make up entirely the officer corps, although some officers did come from this segment of society. But they were also higher ranking than were people in the infantry. So you still have some socioeconomic stratification on this battlefield. It's just not as big a deal as it was in the plebeian manipular cohort, plebeian manipular legion. There we go. You still did have light troops who would go out in front of the army because you still do need some ranged weapons in your first wave of attack. You also had reserves that could be swapped in wherever you needed them, so you weren't as bound to the armor requirements that you had in maniples. You also see the beginning of some state support for military equipment. So at this point, the general begins to requisition supplies and gear replacement and rations and so on. So unlike the classical legion of the 200s, the Punic Wars, where soldiers were by and large supplying all their own equipment, you're still buying a lot of your equipment, but you're beginning to rely more on support from the Roman state itself to help you afford and maintain that gear. And this is important because we're now recruiting from people who can't necessarily afford their armor right out of pocket. So the Legion begins to build structures for that kind of thing. Legionary pay is still pretty pitiful for the first couple centuries, though. We're talking like 2 denarii a year by the time of Augustus, which is like peanuts, guys, peanuts. Another thing that begins to happen at this point, and there is some variation, but as a general rule for the period that we're talking about, and the period we're going to focus on for this unit, which is the Imperial Legion of the 1st century CE, that is the mid to late 100s CE or AD, you sign on for a 20-year term of service. So imagine like if you signed up for the army and it's 20 years, like right out the gate. To us, that's a ludicrously long time. Partly why we don't have that kind of base signing term now is that studies in World War II proved that there's a point at which you begin to lose efficiency because you've had people in the field for way too long, and it's oh gosh, what was that? I think it was like at the 20 mission mark or 6 months. So yeah, regular leaves are important. Yeah, Rome far exceeded that with the 20 years. At the end of the 20 years, though, you do not go home immediately. Instead, you have 5 years where you're a reservist. So there's a kind of intermediary point where you're transitioning out of the military. And at the end of that 5 years, you finally get your land in Gaul or North Africa or wherever it is that Rome has sent you. And then generally you'd settle down with the local girl and have cute little citizen babies, and yay, go you. But imagine people are signing up in their late teens. So say you're a 15-year-old Roman kid. So let's see, that would mean you're 35 by the time you begin to think about retirement, and you're 40 at the point where you get your farm. By the way, if you've ever heard the term buy the farm, that's the practice that gives that term its name. If you haven't heard of this term, buying the farm doesn't mean you're alive. Buying the farm is a military slang term for dying in combat. And this comes from the Roman legion, where you would join up in hopes of getting that farm. And if you died, you were buying the farm. You see, it's a gallows humor kind of thing. And now you know. Bring it up at your socially distanced Thanksgiving or Christmas party. You'll be super popular. Now, I had mentioned that there's more organization below the cohort level and that this creates a sort of village environment. Here's what that looks like. The basic unit of a cohort is the tent party or the tent mates. So 8 people would share a tent, and they would also carry that tent with them when they were on the march. So these were your roommates, and they were the people you ate with, you sang with, you lived with. This was like your nuclear family within the cohort. Now, within that tent party, you'd be in a larger tent group where 10 of your tents made up a century. Century is from the Roman word centum for 100, and rather irritatingly and confusingly, that's 80 people if you were counting. But yeah, so 80 people in a century. And your century was a little bit like your street. Yeah, where everybody on your street was in their tents, and that was your immediate community. And then you had 5 centuries that would make up your cohort. And then each legion had the 10 cohorts. We were just looking at the cohorts earlier. So your cohort was like your suburb, and your legion was like a mobile city. And this is quite literal, as we'll see moving ahead. What this meant, though, is that your bond over years of serving abroad, which Roman armies were now doing, the maniples were developed to be like a seasonal military, where you live most of the time on your farm and you just get together for war season to go out and do your war, and then you'd come home and have your farm. But with these wars abroad that start heating up in the 100s BCE, with all of these wars in Carthage and Macedon and North Africa and so on, you end up spending more time in the army than you are at home, which is how you end up losing your small family farm and getting yourself homeless. By this period, when you're signing up for 20 years and living with your tent mates for 20 years in your cohorts and in your legions, you start bonding with your legion. Your legion is your hometown, and you're retiring in the area where your legion last served. So your primary allegiance and citizenship starts becoming to your legion, not necessarily your hometown or the city of Rome. You start to get in this period entire legions made up of people who had never been to the city of Rome. And by the time we get to Roman Britain, which is our big stop for this period, that is the case. In Roman Britain, most of your legionaries are coming from the Eastern Mediterranean, Eastern Europe, North Africa, for reasons we're going to get into later. You'd never see the city of Rome, but you certainly would be seeing your legionary comrades. One of the things, by the way, I love about the movie Gladiator is there's this one moment where I think Maximus is talking to his aide. Is that what? Quintus, I think is the dude's name. He's like, have you ever seen Rome? And he's like, no. because that was standard. And that's going to be politically important moving ahead. All right. So I mentioned there is a chain of command. Here it is. I'm going to take you on the 5-cent tour, but this slide is mostly here so you have it for later. I'm not going to ask you to memorize this. I'm just going to talk in general terms about what's going on here. So you'll notice in parentheses I have class markers. That's because there's a division between the top of the chain of command and the bottom of the chain of command that still lies on socioeconomic class. Legates are like a legionary commander. So your general isn't commanding just one legion. A general commands multiple legions. And the general is often the provincial commander, sometimes the consul. It just really depends on the war and how the Senate's feeling that week, or later, how the emperor is feeling that week. The legate, however, is the guy who's in charge of your legion. He's got sub-commanders, the wide-banded tribunes, or the tribunus laticlavus. Underneath that, you have the prefect of the camp, who's like the admin officer, but he's still an educated upper-class dude. And then you have a thin-striped tribune. This is also from a senatorial class, but this is like where you send a baby senator who needs to get some military experience as part of a political career. So this officer class can have people who make a career out of it, but it can also include tourists. They're not signing up for 20 years. Some of them are just there for a year or two to get some military experience so they can go back to Rome and do political office. This is also a group that, at least in the early period, generals would recruit and maintain so that they could have limited turnover in the staff. Eventually, under the emperors, there's an effort to disrupt that a little bit, because this becomes a place where generals build power bases, because they can create a political party out of their officer staff, which is, great if you can make it work for you. But this is also why Roman emperors get increasingly paranoid about their generals, because you want your generals to know their staff. Yeah, you end up having problems when you're trying to win a battle with staff you don't know well. However, if you know your staff too well, you can then march them on Rome and kill the emperor. So this is the tension that leadership is going to be playing with through the glory days of the Cohort Legion. Okay, under this red line, we're now getting into the non-commissioned officer territory. So this is the officer corps that are recruited from the body of the Legion themselves. These are the people who have signed on for the 20 years, and some of them will sign on for extra terms at the end of that 20 years if they're particularly talented. The most prestigious person coming out of this rank is the primus pilus centurion. Those of you who know Latin will recognize primus. It gives us prime or primary in English. This means the first, and then pilum, pilum is that very Roman sort of bendy spear that you throw into a shield and it bends. Right? So the first spear centurion is the centurion in charge of the first cohort. That's where the first comes from. He's the first spear in the first cohort. He stands on the front line on the far right. This guy is the baddest badass in the Legion. Although, I don't know, the Aquilifair is also pretty badass, but this guy's pretty badass. He's authorized to use corporal punishment, as indeed everybody is in the command structure in Rome. One of the citizen rights you waive when you join the Roman Legion is the right not to be beaten up with sticks, because it was felt to be necessary that a general be able to beat you up. So when Romans talk about military discipline, they're not talking about just the internal mindset of, following orders and professionalism and so on. What they're talking about is the willingness and ability of the command structure to beat people up who don't follow orders and cooperate and toe the line. So when you imagine military discipline in a Roman context, add more sticks and more violence, and then you've kind of got the flavor. There was a lot of tension around this issue. There were some commanders who used more of it than others, and depending on how good your social skills were, this could make you more or less popular, depending. But keep this in mind because it's a major plot point in your reading for this unit. Tacitus's Agricola, right? So your Primus Pilus Centurion, he's probably one of the baddest badasses, if not the baddest badass. Next down, and another candidate for most badass, is the Aquilifair. So this is the eagle carrier. Fair on the end of something in Latin means carrier of. We use it in words like aquifer is a water-bearing seam in the ground. Right, I was just thinking of another good one and it escaped me at the moment. Oh yeah, the name Christopher means carrier of Christ. So if you know a Christopher, the fur in the name, that's what that's for. That's what it's for. Haha. Spouse is obligated to laugh at that one. Okay, so this person carries the legionary eagle. Hold on to that thought. We're going to talk about that because that's a plot point. Next on the list is your secretary. So an optio is somebody who can write, because an important part of legionary administration that really gets going in the cohort is the need for written records in order to keep track of requisitions and materials, and also to maintain accountability in the command structure. Now, it's not that there weren't people writing in the Manipular Legion, but you start getting a bureaucracy of the Legion in this period, because the Legion's a marching city, and a city needs to have somebody keeping track of where the beans are and how many socks we need this week. Also, as the legions begin to have a budget, because they're buying stuff for people, it becomes really necessary to account for that budget to the legion. Hi, Tavis. Hi. You're very cute. Thank you. So the optio is the guy who does that. So one of the things you might get when you join the Roman legion under the cohort system is an education. And one of our best sources for people learning Latin as a second language in the ancient world are legionary records, because you had a lot of people who had to learn Latin. One of the things the Roman military made you do was learn Latin, because unlike the Persians, Latins, the Romans opted for a single language for their military command structure, and not everybody spoke Latin. And if you've ever taken Latin, you know that it's a little bit of a challenging language, lots of rules, the endings are super duper important. And if you ever struggled with Latin, you're in good company. A lot of legionaries had a really hard time learning Latin, and we have evidence of them struggling in their paperwork. North Africa is a place where a lot of this paperwork survives, but Vindeland is another place where we have ample evidence of this. But if you were good at your literacy skills and could pick up Latin, you could have a great career in the army as one of these clerical staffers. Now, within each century, you had somebody who would carry a pole with eye-catching metal things on it. We'll look at examples of what those are later. That person would wave that stick around in order to signal maneuvers on the battlefield. So that's another sub-command person. So it's a little bit like a unit leader. That's the signifer. And then you also had a trumpet blower. Romans at this period aren't using an aulos like hoplites are. Instead, they turn to brass instruments. So using trumpets to signal maneuvers on the field is something that Romans went in for in a big way. And, well, brass instruments are still a big thing in the military because of Rome. So let's meet a centurion. So this is historical recreator doing an impression of a primus pilus centurion. You can tell he's the primus pilus not so much because of his gear, as Romans didn't do as formal rank insignia as we're used to in uniforms, because even in this period, Romans didn't have a uniform in the way we think of them. You still had a lot of variation in the kind of armor you're wearing and what's on it. However, you could tell a primus pilus and a centurion by looking at the helmet crest, so this sort of horizontal crest on the top of the helmet. That tells you that you have a high-ranking person. And all of these bullae, these round things strapped onto his chest, these are military rewards or medals. So something that Romans start doing is offering these round metal things as rewards for heroism and service in battle. So the medal as a cultural thing that we use to reward good behavior in the military is something that the Romans, if not start, at least popularize and systematize. So this guy has quite a lot of them because he's the primus pilus centurion. He's been around. But that's not the only thing on this uniform that's a reward for military service. You may notice these round open circle things hanging from his chest straps right up near where he's got his focale fastened. Those are torques. And on the next slide, I'll show you the Celtic jewelry that these are meant to look like. So using torques as military rewards started when Romans were battling Celts on a regular basis. First in the Punic Wars, because remember, the Celts of Spain and France are allied with Carthage, not with Rome. And then later Romans turn on Celts themselves, including the Cimbri and the Teutones, who are technically German, but they also wear these torque things around their necks. The nobility of Celtic-speaking peoples would wear these as neck ornaments. So Romans could tell if you're wearing one of these, you're high-ranking. So they try really hard to kill you, and remember, when you kill someone, you take their stuff in this military environment. So what Romans would do, because Romans, mind you, they're not Celts, they don't wear torques. They take the torque and attach it to their uniform as a trophy, and eventually they start giving them out as rewards for different acts of heroism. So the final thing that this dude has, marking him as a primus pilus, or a centurion, I mean, all centurions had these, is that stick he's holding. That's the stick that he's officially authorized to use to smack you if he has a problem with how you're doing your duty. There was a very famous, one particular centurion that we know about because one of his reluctant recruits was a poet named Horace. His nickname was Gimme Another. It's Cede Alteram in Latin. Because one stick wasn't enough for him. He'd be beating you up with a stick so hard that his stick would break, and then he'd yell for his optio. He'd be like, "Give me another!" So his nickname was Give Me Another, because he wouldn't just break one stick on you, he'd break two, because he was just that badass. Again, this gives you an idea of what it's like to be a legionary on a day-to-day basis. There's a lot of hitting people, and not for big things like dropping your shield and running away or not cleaning out the latrine, for stuff like not following orders quickly enough, for getting drunk on duty, for playing dice when you're not supposed to be playing dice, for, I don't know, looking at your commanding officer funny. It can get pretty darn abusive, and it is not a coincidence that when Roman legions rebel, one of the first people who ends up against the wall and beaten to death is the centurion, and particularly the primus pilus centurion. Pretty much every major military revolt in Roman history under the cohort system, yeah, they go for the centurion, because people don't like getting hit with sticks for nonsense, or getting hit with sticks at all. Yeah, there's a reason why hitting people with sticks is no longer a thing that we do. At least I don't think we do that. We use metaphorical sticks now. Yes, so as promised, here is a torque being worn by a Gaul in a war memorial from the Greek-speaking world. So this is from Pergamon in modern-day Turkey. There is also some actual Celtic art showing a Celt wearing his torque up around his neck. And then to give you an idea of how nice these things were and why you might want to strip them off the body of your dead enemy, there's an actual torque. They're made out of golden braided wire, real heavy honkin' things. So you had to be high status to afford one of these, let alone wear them. Hence, trophy. When I said that the Roman legion was a city, sometimes that's quite literal, and nowhere is that more obvious than in their marching camp structures. So one of the things that Marius codifies and the Romans go in for in a big way is having a standardized camping order. Everybody knows where their tent is. They know where their tent goes. They know where everybody else's tent goes. And they have to rebuild this camp layout every night in order to keep from getting attacked. So when they're marching from one place to another and they stop to sleep, the Roman legion will always camp in the same configuration. And one of your duties for the night is going to be to put up a defensive perimeter around this camp and then set up watches so you don't get attacked in the middle of the night, which is a great pro tip, by the way. Don't just camp when you're in the field. Camp in a regular way. Dig your latrines in a hygienic spot. It's another thing this does. Latrine placement, so that you don't get sick legionaries. Romans realized this, so, make sure you always know where your poop is, because your life depends on knowing where your poop is. Also, wash your hands. Romans not so great with hand washing, alas. In winter quarters, so when a legionary was, or rather a legion was stationary, they would camp within a castra structure. So they would make this temporary marching camp into a more permanent camp, and the longer they were there, the more fortified this would get. So over time, units that were stationed for decades, and in some cases centuries, would build up stone walls with stone ramparts and stone buildings with underfloor heating. These could get very, very nice if they were permanent bases. We're going to be looking at some along Hadrian's Wall, which are some of the nicest. Certainly not the only ones to be that nice, though. The name for this in Latin was castra, and you've heard places named after this, even if you didn't realize it, because that C becomes soft in the Middle Ages and turns into Chester, as in like Chester, England. But also every city name in England that ends in Chester started its life as a Roman military fort or encampment. So anything ending in Caster, Lancaster, Dorchester, Winchester, Leicester, Chester, all of these cities in England started as an army camp. And you have so many of them because Britain itself was a garrison island. So one of the things Rome conquered Britain for was to turn it into a military training, supply, and forward deployment base for its armies keeping watch over the Rhine and the German border, which meant that Roman Britain was unusually heavily fortified, with a ridiculously large number of legions per capita. This made Rome incredibly popular in Britain. No, they weren't popular. Although I've seen more than a few documentaries that are like, oh yes, the Britons very quickly got to appreciate Roman occupation because they brought civilization. No. Roman Britain hated having way too many legionaries around because they loot. They loot a lot. More about that later, though. I'm getting ahead of myself. So at any rate, this is that standard layout I was talking about. And you can tell that you're looking at a footprint of a city that began its life as a Roman camp by looking for this um, playing card structure. So it's almost rectangular, but the corners are always rounded because a round corner is more structurally sound and also better to keep watch over. A corner creates a blind spot, whereas a curve allows you to see all the way around the corner of your encampment. There are 4 streets set up at a perpendicular angle and an X right through the middle with an open space that's your announcement and drilling field in the center. The officers' quarters are at the center too, and then there are stables and encampments and tent emplacements around the edges. And then there are always 4 gates on a Roman camp because you always need a back door. So if somebody attacks you on one side, you can always get out on the other side. So in order to lock down a Roman camp on the march or in its permanent encampment, you have to surround the entire darn thing. This is a pretty effective way to manage your military emplacements. So here's another layout of a costra just to give you an idea of what it looks like. It's rotated on its side, but you can see the different places here. This marks the individual tent places. And you'll notice that they're laid out in the order of their cohort. So the same order, generally speaking, in which you line up to do battle is the same order that you line up to make camp and the same order that you live in. So you live, eat, breathe, speak, train, fight in exactly the same place with exactly the same people. So there's a great deal of built-in camaraderie in this kind of mobile community. So I mentioned the eagle bearer and the legionary eagle. This is something that Marius introduces as a safety measure, but also as a way to build troop cohesion. Before the legionary eagle was a thing, each individual unit would have its own standard. So we're looking at one here. I'm going to circle this in red. So this guy wearing the wolf hat, the wolf skin over his helmet, he is the cohort standard bearer, and that's a cohort standard with a little hand on the top. It's pretty typical. And this is used to point directions and relay orders visually. So orders will be relayed both with trumpet blasts, but also with the movement of the standards. So the standard is very practical, but also each standard before Marius was sacred. And one way that a unit commander would often motivate his troops to attack aggressively was to take the standard, throw it into the enemy formation, and then the unit would scramble over itself trying to get the standard back, because if the enemy captured the flag, that was super embarrassing and also would end up making the gods hate you and think you were cowardly and so on. This became a safety hazard, though, because within each legion there were many cohort standards. And you could end up with a situation where people were so focused on the cohort standard that they weren't noticing orders, they were missing retreat orders, and they were also more reluctant to get out of hairy situations, which, if you think for a moment, like, it sounds like it would make you braver, but actually this ends up getting people killed a lot. And Marius is nothing but experienced when it comes to not getting his people killed. So what he, if not introduces, at least popularizes, is the legionary eagle standard. The eagle was the sacred animal of Jupiter, Jupiter, king of the gods, and it's held up on this pole cast in gold. It's bronze with gold leaves, so it's super shiny and pretty and everybody can see it. And you would have one of your most badass people carrying it because it was a target. Romans weren't the only people who knew the eagle was sacred. Everybody knew that the Romans would lose their ever loving mind if you captured their eagle. So everybody was trying to get that eagle to stick it to the Romans. And the Romans would try very hard to protect the eagle. So instead of protecting 20 standards in your legion, you're just protecting the one eagle. But you have to protect it really, really well, because it's sacred to Jupiter. When it wasn't being carried, it was kept in a tent and it was worshipped. There were sacrifices made to it. The payroll chest was kept underneath it because Jupiter was the god who protected your payroll. So this thing had a whole cult built up around it, and the person carrying it was greatly honored. He's wearing a lion skin, and that's not just speculation. The eagle bearer would wear a lion skin in order to look like Heracles or Hercules. Hercules, the hero god, who was the son of Jupiter and this kind of god of badassery. So you combine these two badass images on your most badass soldier and have him standing there with the eagle. Now, there are many occasions in Roman history where this eagle standard gets captured, and it's very embarrassing for the Romans. So should you ever find yourself in a situation where you really want to score a moral victory against Romans, get that eagle. The Romans are going to come after you like nobody's business, but it gives you bragging rights if you can pull it off. Worked out really well for, say, Germania. Yeah, they got 3 eagles. And of course, Crassus's eagle in Parthia. Yeah, Parthia and Germania are the 2 all-time award-winning Roman irritators. So here, again, is that the gold eagle of Jupiter. So here are some pictures from Trajan's column, which is a little later than the reading for this unit, but it gives you an idea of what this looked like. So these are cohort standards. You can see here, this guy's got a wolf or a boar or something, probably a wolf. You can see the different cohort standards here, folks wearing wolf hides on their helmets. The wolf was a throwback to this wolf who nursed the twin founders of Rome, Romulus and Remus. We think here, though, that's a legionary eagle. Now, we have to reconstruct them from written descriptions and from art, because actually, let me back up. We think we may have found a legionary eagle finally. We're still waiting on confirmation over whether it's legit or a forgery. So we might have found one, but as of 2019 at least, we've never found a legionary eagle, both because they're rare, but also because you generally either recycled, you didn't just leave these laying around. So it's just a rare find. So if it's a real eagle, super exciting, but we'll see. Here's what cohort standards look like, just to give you an idea of the variation. The little things on the stick, the round stuff and the shapes and things, would have been a combination of unit awards. So these would be given to the unit for various acts of bravery or courage, or for participation in different campaigns. And sometimes also they would be unit mascots or in jokes. This was a community building sort of stick. On the very end, you see this dragon windsock thing. This is a cavalry standard, and this got to be a thing starting in the 100 CE. The Byzantines really went in for this in a big way. These had whistles on the mouth of the dragon and then a windsock on the end, so it looked like a flying dragon. It would make this screaming noise as the wind whistled through it, because people on horseback would go fast enough. And imagine hearing this whee noise coming out of the fog bank and knowing, oh my God, the Roman cavalry is coming for us. So it's a terror weapon as well as a super nifty sauce thing to have. Yeah, Christmas is coming, guys. Just, I'd like one. Except I'm not in the cavalry, so I really shouldn't have one. Now, the final result of all of this reform was a conflation between the office of military commander and that of political commander, because the end result of all of these things put in place in order to make a stronger military structure that would be more effective against invasion. For Marius, that was invasion by the Cimbri and the Teutones, and he did manage to stop the Germans coming at the border of Rome and trying to settle in Italy. Like, great, gold star for that. But by making these reforms permanent, the general suddenly becomes much better able to gather a loyal following. That means people will vote for him. That means that his popularity and his clout continues to exist even when he's not in political office. Generals are put in charge of units for longer and longer periods also. And this means that for a lot of Romans in the field, their primary loyalty is to their general. The general is the commander of their city, their marching city, their community. They start to love their generals with this rabid devotion that's all caught up with their religious devotion to Jupiter and the eagle and Rome and so on and so forth. Which means that by the end of the 1st century, so a century after Gaius Marius's descendant, Julius Caesar, and then his descendant, Augustus, managed to parlay this military leadership and reputation into a dynasty and into a new constitutional office, that of the emperor. An emperor commands the military as well as having effective veto power over everything the government does. Between these two things, the commander-in-chief and the right to veto, the Roman emperor has sole control over the state. And because the emperor is a hereditary office, not an elected office, the emperor is independent of the machinery of Roman democratic processes. So the Cohort Legion is responsible in large part for Rome ceasing to be a republic in the modern sense of the word republic and becoming an autocracy, an imperial system. And we're going to be checking in Tacitus's Agricola on the knock-on effects for one such Roman general. Because the thing is, once one general's family manages to get to be emperor, they are never unaware that other generals can do exactly the same thing. They can take their army, march it into Rome, take over the state, and become emperor themselves. And indeed, that happens a lot in Roman history. In fact, the entire 3rd century CE is nothing but general after general after general taking over Rome. We're going to end this class with one such war, where in the year 69 CE, there are 4 different emperors, because they all have armies and a lot of loyal fanboys who can't say no to civil war. So here we are looking at the Emperor Tiberius in these two guises. On the left, he's wearing his armor and his cloak addressing his troops. He's the commander-in-chief, or imperator. The word that gives us emperor in English comes from this military function, commander-in-chief. But we get another word for ruler from the Roman word for emperor. The political office of emperor, the princeps, which Tiberius is dressed as here. So this is both the Emperor Tiberius. He's in his armor here as commander-in-chief. Here he's in his toga addressing the Senate. He's got his hand down. So that's when you're addressing your army, your hand's kind of up here like this. When you're addressing the Senate, you're talking to equals-ish. So like your hand's in the middle there. This word ends up giving us the word prince, or principate, principality. So these are 2 words that end up giving us our vocabulary for leadership today. And so this is a be careful what you wish for and be careful how you administer your military. The cohort system was a super duper efficient way to recruit, train, maintain, and administer your large standing army. But it was also a really good way to set yourself up for civil war and autocracy. So that's some information that might be useful to you. Have a lovely Thanksgiving, and stay tuned for our next lecture, where we'll talk about the nitty-gritty of military equipment in the Cohort Legion.